As part of that, and I love the distinction that you're drawing here, that really speaks to my Marxist ears of, even regardless of the compensation levels, there's a structure between worker and boss that is kind of a technical function, not necessarily, even if you are relatively better off. And how do you position yourself in terms of this sort of broader movement, most particularly with Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign? I do think that is the sort of, from an electoral point of view, that's definitely the core site, the most important intervention in politics today, creating a Sanders presidency. And as part of that distinction is some actual sense that, on one hand, it's so commonsensical, and it definitely is not particularly radical, but there is a democratic socialism to it. There is the notion that, the economy should be a site of democracy as well, and that big unaccountable industries and companies, Amazon, Walmart, Exxon, so on, they really need to be brought to heel in a broader sense of not just necessarily reformed, but really fundamentally rethinking how we relate to them. And of course, things like totally decommodifying healthcare. Do you position your politics that way? Or you sort of, would you kind of fall inside that broader movement and tradition? And is that sort of more broadly how you conceive your politics in a kind of democratic socialist way?
Absolutely. I do describe myself as a democratic socialist, and I want to offer a couple ideas here that might introduce some tension with the concept as it's traditionally construed. I am a socialist, which is to say I favor putting people before profit and communities before corporations. A couple examples of how that shows up in my policy vision is, for instance, a commitment to dismantling mass incarceration, as well as mass surveillance, the central target of my work for so many years. It also involves wanting to not only defend human rights that are in crisis, for instance, at our nation's border, but I also want to expand human rights to include healthcare, housing, and food in the United States. I'm also, though, I say very frequently that as a constitutional lawyer who has, my whole career has been effectively under an age of mounting authoritarianism, invisible, I think, to many people around whom it has grown, who have grown very alarmed in the course of the last 2 years, or 3 years, I suppose, as a tyrant has taken the helm of our federal government. I like to say that I put the D back in democratic socialism. And what I mean by that is our country has at least 4 independent compounding threat vectors that are eroding our democracy under our feet. Now, I'll try to do this quick, and we can explore any of them that might be particularly interesting. But the first is just the front door, and that's voting rights. The Supreme Court a few years ago struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and it basically opened the door to Republican state legislatures to start attacking voting rights. That's exactly what they've done. You don't need a computer to hack an election. Our elections have been getting hacked out in the open by vote suppression tactics promoted by the right wing for the last several years, and which is to say, our democracy is under a direct assault. And I'm not, whatever the Russians are doing, the people I'm worried about hacking our elections are Republicans, and they're using the law.
This is just a ding 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 shofar like dance hall bass line for our show. We've said that so many times. It's all happening here. The Republicans, the oligarchs, it's right in front of your face. Please, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I resonated with that so much, but sorry, go ahead.
No, please. And I love that the resonance for you took the form of a bass line.
Yes.
As a DJ, that's right down my alley. So we talked about the voting rights in the front door. Our democracy, though, is also crumbling from each of its corners. And so just to explain some of those, fair and independent courts were described by the founders of our country in the Federalist Papers as the fulcrum on which liberty rests. Brett Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court. We don't have anything resembling equal justice. I've spent years of my career trying to, working at the American Constitution Society, develop a pipeline of progressive jurists who, when we had a Democratic administration in the White House, we could find no support for. Even Presidents Obama and Clinton have generally appointed prosecutors and defense lawyers and big corporate lawyers to the bench, and they might be prosecutors of color, but they're no less predatory than their other people who've done the same work. And so The right wing has been stacking the courts with right-wing ideologues. Democratic presidents have been stacking the courts with ultimately right-wing ideologues, and our courts are lost to us as meaningful avenues to seek justice. So we've got majoritarian rule through the voting process that's falling apart. We have counter-majoritarian rights that are falling apart because we can't get equal access to the courts. Two other dimensions here, just to grip. One is mass surveillance, and it's not privacy that I'm worried about as much as it matters. What I am concerned about is freedom of conscience, because privacy is what you call it if you have the privilege of raising your voice, regardless of what happens to you. If you don't have privilege, if you are a vulnerable person, what other people call privacy is ultimately agency and autonomy. And without agency and autonomy for individuals, we can't have a democracy for our society. It requires individuals having agency. It's why we have a First Amendment, which incidentally includes not only your right to speak, but also your right to hear, which is why in an age of surveillance, all of our First Amendment rights are threatened and undermined, whether you have anything to say or not. Edward Snowden has made the point, and he's right. If you think you have nothing to hide and therefore nothing to fear, it's because you have nothing to say, and that's true. But further, even those of us who have nothing to say still have a right to hear from all of the people who are silenced, knowing that they're being watched. That is the essential part that I think a lot of people don't understand about surveillance, is it has nothing to do about security. It has nothing to do about, I mean, it has a great deal to do with privacy, and unfortunately, unfortunate ways. But the point is that it is democracy destroying, and that's why I am committed to stopping it. And then finally, the fourth way our democracy is crumbling is through executive secrecy. You know, you could chalk that up to CIA torture. You could talk about the classification scheme. So much of our government is secret. And in all of these different ways, it is not just the socialist vision that I aspire to. I also aim simply to preserve what vestiges remain of our democracy and to build and expand on them.
You know, this is some of the closest parallels, I mean, that you could actually look to, frankly, my politics. People are very curious about these questions. And I think, frankly, what you're articulating of this radical expansion and redefinition in the economic sphere, and maybe, I don't know, you know, I would push that extremely far. And I am a capital S socialist in those realms. But the way you would fuse that with really recognizing that in the domains of open exchange, accountability of power, privacy, and the seamlessness of holding those things in terms of government overreach, but also corporate overreach, and how seamless those things are in the tech economy, you're spelling out something here that I think is like the perfect fusion of the politics of our time. And also, I want to say, I have to give a shout out to Harvey K, because I know he's smiling right now at this, like, that this radical socialism that also builds and expands on the best of what we've always done.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I certainly aim to me, as I was saying before, my lens is sort of what's liberatory and what's the locus of social control, and I've always, my whole career and life, really just gone toward the liberatory options. For most of my life, that's branded me a radical leftist. And if you were, for instance, to poll my law school classmates, I finished law school in 2003, I'm pretty certain I was probably the very least likely person in my law school class to run for office, if only because, you know, my positions were untenable in that day and age. But as particularly a generation of millennials got shafted in the 2008 financial crisis and radicalized by a Democratic president allying himself with the banks, exposing the bipartisan corruption of our system and the extent to which it basically is an extraction complex to take wealth from people and give it to corporations. I think that that entire generation's radicalization was visible first in the Occupy movement, and a lot of people claimed at the time, and maybe some in retrospect, that the movement was unsuccessful, but they didn't understand that it was just the jab. You know, Bernie 2016 was the hook, AOC in 2018 was the uppercut, and I aim to land the knockout blow on bipartisan corporate rule. And we are going to recover a working party for working Americans. And the Democratic Party, that's ultimately what we are here to do, not only to recover and liberate a single congressional seat for the people of San Francisco, but ultimately to end the Democratic Party's complicity in corporate rule.
I love it. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time. and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.